Welcome to the Inquisitive podcast. This podcast is all about searching for answers to questions oftentimes unexplained or unexplored. We want to engage with new and sometimes old theories, psychology, or philosophy from a research based perspective. Hello, and welcome to the fifth episode of the Inquisitive Minds podcast, where today we're going to be talking about binge watching. So before we jump straight into the topic and get going, I want everyone to know that we have set up an email address for you guys to contact us. So if you guys have any thoughts about the previous recorded episodes, if you have any ideas for new episodes coming up, maybe you have a topic in mind that you really want us to talk about but don't have time to look it up on your own, drop us a line. The email is IQ, so the letters IQ, mindspodcast@gmail.com. So that's IQMindspodcast@gmail.com. So, with that out of the way, Johnny, how are you doing tonight? And how do you feel about this topic, binge watching?
Feeling pretty good. Classic response.
Yeah.
Same old. And probably the same old response to the topic. I think it'll be a fun topic. Just talking about binge watching and television and our culture around it and the psychology around it.
hmm So, let's get right into it. We'd like to start with some history here. And TV history is not very long, but we did kind of dig something up here. So, what I found was there are distinct eras of TV watching history. The first of, we'll call those TV 1, TV 2, TV 3. So the first one, TV 1, is essentially from the mid 1950s to the early 1980s. So this is essentially where there was only a few networks, like you only had a few channels, but there was like really huge audiences, and there was like barely any selections of your channel. And let's say the president was making a speech or something, like that's all you got to see. If the moon landing was happening, it was like on all three channels. Like this, obviously it changed from the 50s to the 80s. There was a bit of a difference, but this era of TV was essentially you had a very small amount of choice, but there was a huge audience base watching TV. Then TV2 is from the 1980s to the 1990s. So this is where channels and networks start to expand. We have more quality of TV, and also the networks try to like have their own niche audiences. You have like this is a sports channel, Sportsnet comes out and they only do sports, and they have their channel just to do that. And then you have the drama channel and the so on and so forth, right? And you kind of have a distinction in what you can watch, and there's more options. But mainly people sit down and watch TV, and there's normal advertisements throughout. And then we move to TV3. So this is from the late 1990s to the present day. And we can talk a bit more about how maybe we think the present day has changed to a TV4. But right now, people still think TV3 is from 1990s to the present day. And that includes the proliferation of different avenues in which to watch TV. So illegal downloading or DVDs. Like you get a box set, and you're able to watch your favorite show with all its extras and all of its um, blooper reels and all this stuff. This is kind of TV3. You're more connected to a specific show, and you're buying DVDs or you're downloading the show, or maybe TiVoing a show to watch it because you're specifically in line with one show. Now we get into TV4, which I would argue is what we're now in, which is the digital streaming platform of television, where you can pause, rewind TV, you can binge watch 5 or 6 episodes in a row, you can choose from a mass amount of different TV shows, and you don't have to go to a certain channel at a certain time. So that's our brief history of television. Johnny, anything to add to that?
It just seems like TV4 is almost like a similarity to TV2 with adding the inclusion of all the channels. It's like now it's the inclusion of all the streaming platforms. It's almost like TV 2.5. Like like it's evolving from there. It's not so much the the DVD box sets
Hmm.
and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that the idea of the TV4 though is separating you from your TV set even. So
Yeah, yeah, that's a big point.
so like moving away from ever having to just sit down on a couch or sit down with your TV dinner or whatever. You've got your phone, you've got your laptop, you've got your computer, your PC, and also your TV to view the
Yeah,
content, the television show, which is now I'm assuming a name that's going to change over the course of our history. We're going to move away from calling things TV shows, and it's just going to be maybe just program or something, because it's going to be less connected to the physical TV.
yeah,
But that's just
yeah.
a theory.
It's just funny that we still call it television shows as you're watching it on your iPad.
Yeah, yeah. Like, but that's the history of it. So next, I wanted to get in defining binge watching because this is an interesting psychological thing. Is binge watching in the research that I was looking at was mainly watching 3 episodes or more of something in a row in one sitting. And Johnny, would you agree with that as a?
Yeah, the average definition I tend to see with binge watching was ranging from like 2 to 4. I mean,
Mhm.
2 to 6 episodes. Sorry,
Yeah.
which is sort of what you were saying.
But the difference being between binge watching a show, let's say we watch 3 episodes of a half an hour show, well, that's only an hour and a half of time. But if we sit down and watch a movie, which is 2 hours or more, we're not in the same binge watching category. So this makes it a weird distinction in people's minds is like, I'm not binge watching a movie because it's the same amount of time, but I am binge watching these shows. And I think we to break that down a bit, and I'm not sure if you'd agree, Johnny, but to break that down, to me, it's because you're sitting down, you're watching a show. It's meant to be viewed within 30 minutes or maybe an hour. And you sit down, you
Yeah,
watch it to completion. It has the beginning and the end. And
y-
then,
like we're used to watching one show at a time before we move on.
mhm,
So I think it sort of just stems from being able to watch the same series more than once. I think that's sort of why it's 2 to 6 or like 2 to whatever, is you're getting the same show multiple times.
mhm. Yeah, and even the literature is not like very specific about this, at least the studies I read, but let's say you're binge watching, but you're watching different shows. It's not the same. It's not binge watching, you know? Even though you sit down for an hour and a half, you watch 3 different shows. The literature doesn't consider it binge watching.
Huh.
I
Yeah, it seems more of just
just watching the one.
consuming a lot of television
Yeah.
rather than trying to define it by binging it.
Yeah.
It's like where if you drink a lot of different alcohols, it just you like it's not binge drinking if you're
I don't
mixing it
know.
up.
I don't know. Yeah, that's the interesting thing, but the literature doesn't say, at least the studies I read, it doesn't specifically say had to be different, had to be the same show, which
Yeah, like it's like trying to define something that's still been around for a while.
yeah.
Like people watching lots of TV is not something new,
Mhm.
but watching um the same show almost the whole series in one sitting is definitely something new.
Mhm. And it's new with TV3 because of the DVD box set, but it's more streamlined now because of the autoplay features and the massive amounts of choice and just the ease of play. Like everything is easier for
Yeah,
you to
the
continue to binge.
accessibility.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I wanted to throw down some stats for us to try to get our heads wrapped around how big of an issue, if it's an issue, binge watching is. So in 2020, right now, Netflix has 183 million subscribers worldwide. But as we all know, we can share subscriptions of Netflix, and it estimates that there are 300 million people who are able to watch Netflix, which is crazy. 300 million. And that's not even counting people who are only using other streaming services such as Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, all these ones that have cropped up in the recent years. but Netflix is the biggest one,
Oh
300
yeah.
million. So in the
That's
United States alone, there are 60 million in the US who are subscribed. Um, 23% of adults will stream Netflix in the United States daily. Um, According to Netflix, 70% of their users binge watch. Of course, we don't know exactly what they mean. They could describe it as just 2 episodes in a row, um, but that's still an astounding amount, 70%. Um, if you're familiar with the show Tiger King, which was a big show, 34.3 million people in the US watched the entirety of Tiger King in its first 10 days being released.
Jesus.
It's insane.
That's so many.
And then the last stat I want to drop for you here, which I thought was astounding, was well, actually, sorry, two more stats. The first one, which is still astounding, is Netflix consumes 15% of the internet's bandwidth worldwide.
Really?
Yeah, 15% of the
That
internet's bandwidth worldwide.
wow. I that speechless. Can't
And
even think of a word to
to
describe it.
compare it with something else that could be equivalent, and I thought would be more so, is YouTube. YouTube is actually 11.4% of the world's
And
bandwidth.
YouTube has more users, but again,
Hmm.
it's free, so I mean, I guess it's easier to make accounts. But
Hmm.
yeah, like it's I'm surprised it uses so much kind of bandwidth of the internet.
Hmm.
Like if you're comparing it to other services that have more users like Facebook and YouTube and
Hmm. For sure.
wow.
So
Um
the last thing I wanted to add was kids are growing up with this, and this is like the only thing they know. So another kind of interesting stat I found was that 82% of children that are in Netflix only households, so like their parents don't have any sort of cable, 82% of those kids don't know what commercials are, which is, amazing. Could you imagine? Anyways.
the dream. But
So, yeah.
just just like all these stats are just showing the sheer number of users and the numbers of people that are tuning into television and stuff, right? It's a
Mhm.
large percentage of people.
Yeah, and I think it's just justification for us to go over this topic. Like
Yeah,
is
because
is
everybody knows what TV is.
and everybody
It's
has had
it's
their
so
own.
cultural.
Hmm. And everybody
And
has binge watched, I think, at this point. A lot of people, maybe not if you're in a population that's over the age of 30 or 40, maybe you haven't succumbed and you prefer to schedule your television as you have for your whole life, or maybe you just don't watch television. But
mhm.
a huge majority of younger individuals under the age of 25, under the age of 30, even have experienced the binge watching. So,
And speaking of people like younger, like age to 18 to 29, finishing a new season of a show within 24 hours of release, 51% of 18 to 29-year-olds complete an entire season within 24 hours of release. It's
wow.
crazy.
Yeah, it's just if a show drops that you're attached to or you really want to get into, or maybe you're just trying to catch up to your friends, and we'll talk about this more. You sit down, you watch it the whole day or something, right? And that's the glory of the
Yeah,
binge
yeah,
watching.
glory.
The glory,
Yeah,
so
in all its
or the
glory.
shame, or the shame. So in this, so this leads us into what I want to talk about next is comparing this form of binge watching, this form of binging to other forms of binging. Do we think that it's on the same level as, like you mentioned before, alcohol binging or
Yeah.
drug binging or binge eating, these other things that we know to be detrimental to people's health, psychologically, physically? Is binge watching on the same level? What do you think?
It's I like as when you describe it as the same level, it's I think it's hard to fit it in, but I think it can like it's a form of an addiction. Now
Okay.
I'll describe addiction
Okay.
that I found It's a compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite adverse consequences.
Right.
So technically, I could consider binge watching fit in this definition of addiction because there's there's adverse consequences to spending your whole day watching television.
Right.
So I could fathom that it's a form of addiction
Hmm.
easily, like at some point. And now, is it the same level as binge drinking often, where that's becoming like an addiction of alcoholism?
Probably not. Yeah. This is where we have to be fully fledged psychologists to really make that distinction, I think,
Yeah,
which we are not. And I would agree with you that there are certain levels of addictive tendencies. You give that description, and I think I would say, okay, what are the adverse effects of somebody binge watching? And we can get into a bit more of that later, but that's along the lines of like lack of sleep and maybe obesity and stuff like this. Like because you're watching so much TV, you're not taking care of yourself.
yep,
But it's are the adverse effects as prevalent to compared to other sorts of binging? Like if you're binge eating, is it and binge drinking? These seem
yeah,
to be much worse for you than binge watching something, which kind of
hmm,
has, it's not like directly adversely affecting you, whereas binge binge drinking is directly like burning brain cells, kind of thing.
yeah. Like even without the addiction, comparing binge drinking to binge television watching,
Hmm.
where binge drinking, it's not necessarily an addiction if you just say you do it, you're planned and it's once every so often and such,
Hmm.
is the equivalent to just planned binge watching television.
Right. So like, yeah, I so to kind of sum up where we stand on this, I would say it can be bad for you, but it's definitely not on the same level. And I think it's if you're planning out a binge watching session, it's no like slight on your character, and I don't think people are ever gonna like bat an eye, and I don't think it's ever gonna get to the point where we are like condemning binge watching. You know what I mean?
And the same as we don't really condemn binge drinking either if it's not really an addiction.
Right. Yeah. The adverse effects are less so, I
Probably
think.
much stronger in
Binge drinking. Yeah.
alcohol, yeah.
Okay. From there, I want to move on to kind of what people are experiencing when they're watching a show. What what is driving people to binge watch a show? Why are we so engaged in these television shows? What is making it engaging? And the first couple things I wanted to go over was more of like a connection to the characters and a connection to enjoyment. Like what people want to watch something that they enjoy and why are they enjoying it? So so what I found in my research was there are two different types of enjoyment that were studied in regards to watching television. The first one was hedonic enjoyment. So this is if you're a hedonist and you just want to enjoy, you just want to be pleasured, and it's just like basic enjoyment. And the second one was eudaimonic enjoyment, which essentially is being being emotionally sucked into something, I think. So in the case of watching a TV show, it's like feeling the emotions that the characters are going through or having emotions drawn out of you, either if it's laughter or if it's tears, like this kind of thing is enjoyable. So what I looked at was how, like, which of these two is more prevalent? Johnny, did you have anything to add about those two types of enjoyment?
Um, it's yeah, like it's very the way I see it, it's is similar to like lower attentiveness and higher attentiveness. Like lower attentiveness shows are like kind of you don't need to focus on them. You just like they're just kind of playing and you're just kind of watching, relaxing. Whereas the higher attentiveness ones tend to be like the dramas where you're like fully invested. And you
Hmm.
have to focus and see all the plot details and stuff. And episode to episode sort of follows.
Hmm.
Whereas with the lower attentiveness, they're like one offs.
Hmm.
If you miss one episode, no big deal.
Right. So what I found from a few studies in my research was that the hedonic enjoyment is not a big driving factor in becoming a binge watcher. People don't want to just like soak up television to just have something to enjoy. Do you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
if you sit down and you eat an ice cream, that's like hedonic enjoyment. Like you just want to eat the ice cream. But people don't do that with television. They're more so attached to the emotions. Like the eudaimoc enjoyment was way more of a driving factor for people to be binge watching these types of shows. So they'd sit down, they'd have a laugh, they'd have a cry, or maybe they'd be super anxious, or maybe there would be horror involved and there's like a jump scare. Like these kind of like emotional roller coasters were more likely to bring you to bring you to watch more and more episodes in a row.
They're just kind of more consuming. They're getting the person to really engage and immerse themselves into the show.
Hmm.
And I had to guess that more of the newer shows that are coming out are more along these lines because the platform wants you to spend more time on their platform, and by doing so they see that people are binging longer sessions with these type of shows.
Yeah, and the writing is changing too, and we'll get into that. But I want to leave it for a bit later. So the next thing I wanted to look at was relationships that a viewer is having with the characters in the show. So this is something that I saw broken down in the research into two different types, which was a parasocial relationship. So this is kind of like friendship ties. So let's say I'm watching a drama or something, and I slowly begin to like a character, and I like that character so much that I kind of see them as a friend. And if something bad were to happen to them, I would be emotionally upset. If something good would
Hmm.
happen to them, I would be happy for them, kind of thing. So this is one type of relationship that people have, viewers have with characters. The other type is identification. So this is not identifying as them. This is not um, see, this is more you seeing their side of things. So let's say if a character is like really down on their luck and they're a scrappy fighter or whatever, you're slowly seeing from their perspective and they're having these emotional outbursts and you're like, why would he do that in that scenario? That doesn't make any sense. But you kind of like, oh, he's just like not brought up properly or something, and then you kind of identify how the character is living. So these are the two types of types of attachments to characters that I saw. Johnny, do you have anything to add?
Mm, not so much towards characters enjoyment, but I can definitely see how like a really well written character is like plays such an important part
Mm-hmm.
in like getting you to continue with the series and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
With like especially with how many series are out there, right? They have to tie you in, and if the character isn't really interesting you, you can just move on so easily.
Mm-hmm. So what I found was more so the parasocial relationships where you're kind of becoming a friend with somebody, and less so the identification. The yeah, identification with a character keeps you engaged, right? So if I if I suddenly lose a character, I feel like a sense of loss. Or if I've finished the series even and I come to the final episode, I feel a sense of loss because I feel like I've built a relationship with those characters, and that's what
Hmm.
keeps people watching. Less so the identifying with them and seeing things through their eyes, kind of thing.
Huh. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense
Hmm.
that is a larger role than sort of the seeing what other people are seeing.
Hmm.
I mean, it's like empathy, but
Yeah. So now we've kind of we kind of gone over the main things about why people would watch shows, and we'll talk more about that. But now I want to kind of talk about more of the viewer. What is driving the viewer? Like, what kind of conditions are the viewer under that they would want to watch
like
more?
what are the motivations for binge watching? Is that what you're trying to
More like is an individual lonely? Are they watching TV because they're lonely? Is it because they're depressed? Is it because of just habit because every day they come home, they just watch their episodes, these kind of things. So, what did you think about this, Johnny?
I feel like one of the more common reasons that people would like to say is like for relaxation.
Yeah, that's probably one of the bigger ones.
So like they come home from their stressful day at work and they're like, "Oh, I just want to relax and
Hmm.
watch TV for the rest of the night."
Hmm.
Or I think another big one I saw was like catching up, trying to like there's so many shows out there and they found one they liked. They found a few they liked. They're like, "Oh, I got to catch up before new ones come out."
Hmm.
And there's always new ones coming out. Um like a sense of completion. Some people like once they start, they can't stop. They got to finish the whole series.
Yeah.
Glad that's not me.
I think
uh,
I
yeah,
think to go back to your catching up one, another big part of that is like getting to be a part of the community of people,
yeah,
because
the social inclusion,
a lot of people are, again, with the fear of missing out. FOMO is attached to
FOMO.
so
Yeah.
many things in our lives nowadays. But in regards to this one, because if you're moving away from the weekly viewings, and of course, some shows are still doing this where they release the episode once a week, and we've seen it with like shows like The Mandalorian, or the biggest show on TV was Game of Thrones for a long time. People would watch an episode and then they'd go to their water cooler and they'd talk about it. But that's getting moved away from with the binge watching, where instead of having those conversations at the water cooler once a week, you
Yeah,
have them on an online forum, and you kind of, if you're up to date, then you can talk on the forums, and if you're not, you have to kind of avoid them, right?
that's sort of like a con though to binge watching is sort of this social and like the social aspect.
Hmm.
Sure, like there's that community online you can go, but everyone's at like certain different points with binge watching.
Hmm.
So like everyone's at the same point in scheduled linear TV. Each episode kind of comes out, and like if you watched it that week, you've caught up. Everyone sort of talks about it and hypes them up for the next week. With binge watching, this I saw an article saying the social media buzz of the show drops drastically over time as the binge show is watched. So like sure there's like a lot of talking right when it comes out, and then it sort of divvies off because everyone's at such different points because everyone's sort of watching it at their own pace.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you think about Tiger King, like we mentioned earlier, and if you haven't watched the show, a large amount of memes came out of the show, and if you had watched the show, you probably saw those because social media is so prevalent. But if you didn't watch that show, if you're watching the show now, let's say you were like, oh, what's the show? I want to watch it. There would be like almost no media buzz around it. Nobody would ever be talking about it.
Hmm.
Whereas if
Old news.
yeah, old news, it's gone. If you wanted to try to message somebody or talk to them, they'd be like, "Oh, yeah, I remember that when it happened. Why didn't you watch it then? Like, what's going on?" It'd be
or or
strange.
they or they like don't remember it that well because they've sort
Yeah.
of crammed it all in, so when everyone's talking about it it's all fresh, but it's not really being saved into your long-term memory,
No.
sort of like cramming for an exam or midterm.
Yeah.
It's like, oh man, like I got it all in, did the test, and then a week later, and it's like I know nothing.
Mm. So, um, I wanted to talk a little bit about loneliness, because this one is like one of the big ones. Loneliness and depression kind of go hand in hand. But when I was looking at the research, I was finding that loneliness was not getting linked to binge watching. So that means when somebody is more lonely and they begin a binge watching session, and they maybe, over the span of a week, there was a few studies that were taking people's moods after they binge watch for the span of months. Did it get worse? Did they feel more lonely because of the binge watching? And most of the studies I found, actually all the studies I found, said no, the loneliness was not affected by binge watching.
Hmm.
So,
It, Yeah, it feels like it can almost sort of go either way.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're lonely, so they're binge watching as an escape from their loneliness,
Mm-hmm.
or since they're binge watching, they're spending a lot of time alone in front of a TV, making it seem like they're extremely lonely.
Right.
And which way does they say it wasn't linked to that?
They were
So TV,
TV. The watching of binge watching TV was not making you more lonely. So
gotcha.
it's possible that loneliness could cause binge
Cause
watching.
binge watching, yeah, that way.
Yeah. But what I was reading was saying the other way does not.
That does
They're not
not, yeah.
correlated. Yeah. Which I mean, of course, I would have to
It's
do a lot more research, but I didn't find it, and
it
that goes for depression as well. You know.
yeah, like it's sort of hard to tie it in. Like it's almost something you can kind of correlate to because there's a few I saw that had like reported higher levels of loneliness and depression
Hmm.
from people that binge watch, but it doesn't seem like it's a direct cause. Like it's
Hmm.
like it there could be maybe something to it, but in order to isolate it, I don't. It would be so difficult, and it totally makes sense why there's like so little sort
Hmm.
of direct studied kind of
Hmm.
research or data on it.
Yeah.
Because I can totally see someone making the point that loneliness
Causes.
causes it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not confident in saying that this type of binge watching is like affecting somebody to make them more lonely or more depressed. So
Hmm.
I think that's where I would stand on that. But some other ones that we did find pretty concrete evidence that led to binge watching was lack of self regulation. So if somebody is less self regulated, and there was the studies I read through gave out different quizzes and different surveys and had specific questions that, when responded to, they would determine how much of a regulation the person had over themselves. And if you are less likely to be self-regulating, you are more likely to be a binge watcher, right? These things make
Hmm.
make sense.
It's like the self control. Like if you're exerting self control in the context of your media use,
Hmm.
like the less likely you're gonna start binge watching a ton.
Hmm.
And like it sounds like obvious where it's like, oh yeah, if I've self control, I'll just do X less. But like it's prevalent and it's tough because there's just so much different episodes. There's so many different shows out there
Hmm.
and so much like sheer amount of content that it's so hard to exert that self control now.
Hmm. And
And that's
there's.
sort of like a feature and not a bug. Like the
Hmm.
shows want you to do like they want you just to sit in front of it all day long.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing is the social pressure, like we discussed. Like you're always missing out on that show that everybody's
Yeah, the
talking about.
FOMO, yeah.
The buzz around that show is making you want to watch it. And yeah, so self-regulation was a big one. Another one that I wanted to talk about was transportation. So this means immersion, how well you are immersed into a show.
Yeah. And before we move into immersion and kind of continuing a little bit more with sort of self control and self regulation,
Yeah, sure.
I saw a big one was like guilt.
Oh, yeah.
And when I looked into guilt, it sort of is the reason that I try to avoid binge watching. And it's it's related to like conflict of goals and responsibilities.
Hmm.
So like a negative self evaluation of yourself triggered by like your conflicts between goals. So like if you're like, oh, I want to take out the trash and exercise tonight and this and that, and instead you just end up getting sucked in and watching TV all night, that has like a, a harmful effect on your short term well being because you're like, oh man, like I feel so guilty. I didn't do X, like I didn't do my tasks or my goals,
Hmm.
and that can make you feel like garbage or whatever. And it even starts like affecting your long-term satisfaction
Hmm.
in life if you continue to do it more often than not. And it's something that I sort of deal with, and I never really saw it as guilt until I was doing all this research, and it just describes it so well.
Yeah, you feel like that trash you forgot to take out. Um, no, for sure, that is a big one, and I think, like you said, people don't realize that's the emotion that they're having is the fact that okay, I sat and I binge watched all this stuff, and I got through my TV, but why do I feel crappy? And it's because
Yeah,
you are putting stuff off, and you're guilty because of that.
and it's like one of the big pros that people love to say about binge watching TV is all the autonomy you have and the self governing sort of freedom you have with the shows. Like you have the whole season at your fingertips and you can watch it at your own pace. But it's also a double edged sword
Yeah,
because if it's only released once a week, you can only watch one episode. It's over. You have
yeah,
to wait till next week. If you have the whole season and you're like, this show is awesome, like sure, oh man, like I can watch at my own pace, but sometimes your own pace is not what you want.
it's
Like
not, it's not healthy for your
no,
yeah for your daily goals, especially if
yeah,
you
your
are.
your well being. Like sure, like you get that instant gratification, like oh
Mhm,
man, this dopamine hit,
yeah.
but like then like after an hour or so, you're like this doesn't feel so well.
This is all Johnny's personal opinion, by the way.
Yeah,
This is not grounded in anything we researched.
yeah,
But
I saw guilt. This is exactly what I saw in
sorry.
articles
Yeah, guilt. But
and research studies.
okay, moving on. Another reason for potential binge watching is the immersion factor. So, this one I thought was interesting because, like you said, we have so much control over our ability to watch programs at our own pace. So, why don't we get so into this show and watch 5 episodes in a row, and I'll just be like totally sucked into the whole world and like know exactly what's going on, be super transported into the world that I'm watching. So, the research I was looking at kind of mentioned that they were tracking people's transportation. They were calling it transportation, not immersion, into the show and how well they were sucked in. And they compared it to watching weekly versus compared it to binge watching it. And what they found was that if you're watching it weekly, you have the same level of immersion as if you're watching it in a binge setting. So I found that pretty interesting. So I guess what they're trying to say is just the amount of concentration you give to your programming is what determines how well immersed you are in it. Johnny?
Yeah, I that's just one of the things that it's always towed around is like that you're so much more immersed in binge watching shows, and that's sort of the big like one of the big pros and stuff. And for like to say, oh, it's the same, I feel like a lot of people would probably disagree with you.
Hey man, it's I can link you to articles. I'm
No,
just
no, I'm not like agreeing or disagreeing, but
hmm
it sort of makes sense in terms of like on a focus level.
hmm
Like if you're 100% focused on something, what difference is it if you're 100% focused, right?
yeah,
Like 100% focus on a binge watch compared to 100% focus on your once a week TV show, it's still 100% of your focus.
yeah,
No, like is focus essentially just can be compared to immersion?
yeah. I think
I
so.
could see it.
I would even argue that you're probably more immersed when you're watching it once a week because you kind of have to you're waiting for it all week, let's say, and you sit down and you're ready to watch it and it comes on at 7 and you're sitting and you watch it and you take it all in from its beginning to end and then you can't watch anymore. There's no chance
Yeah.
for you to lose
No
focus, right?
redos. You have to be
You
focused. There's
have
no
to, yeah, there's
rewinding.
yeah, exactly. Whereas nowadays if you sit and you watch 3 episodes in a row, you kind of have to log all that into your memory so it's harder for you to do so,
Yeah.
and you kind of can get sidetracked. Halfway through an episode, you're like, oh, I can just go back or whatever, right? So the immersion is probably even less so for the binge
Okay,
watcher.
let's compare this to say like a movie at a movie theater.
Yeah,
And the it's super loud. You're in like the IMAX. The screen is huge.
right.
The volume is like pumping. Are you the equivalent immersion to you sitting in your home on your little 40-inch TV watching a movie?
No, you're not. This is the obvious answer. Right.
Is
So,
it comparable in terms of binge watching to linear TV?
mm,
Like
so
if
uh,
it's so if you're I guess if you're isolating the setting, so the setting is sort of the immersion and not so much what you're watching?
right. So I think well, what you're watching affects it. But let's say you're watching your favorite TV show and a new episode just came out. You sit down and you watch just the one episode. You would
Mhm.
you would have to like pay attention, and it doesn't. Maybe let's say you can pause it and rewind it, like it's on a
Yeah.
streaming platform, but only one episode came out. You would sit down, you'd watch it, you'd be intent, and you'd have enough attention. But then let's say a whole new season of your show drops. You sit down, you watch one episode, and then the second episode, you get thirsty, you got to go to the washroom, and you kind of like other things are happening, and your phone is blinking, and
Yeah.
like there's distractions available. The longer you watch a show, the more distractions become available. That's all I'm saying.
But was is commercials not a huge distraction that take you out of the immersion?
Yeah, they could be, but let's say,
I think that's one of the big points
yeah.
is commercials would like pull you out of the immersion
Hmm.
because then you can get up and walk around and you're not really into the same feel and environment.
No, for sure. But I mean, there are shows like The Mandalorian, which is streaming on Disney Plus. They release an episode once a week, so you
Hmm.
kind of have the same ability to pause and rewind, and there's no commercials. But you're watching it once a week, and when it comes out, you're like excited, and you have that sit down, and then you have the water cooler conversation
That's
afterwards.
sort of like the happy medium
Yeah,
is
yeah,
is the streaming platform with no commercials dropping the show once a week.
yeah.
You get the best of everything
But
unless
then
you like want to watch the entire series immediately.
Yeah, but then you could just wait. You could wait to the end. All
Oh
the
yeah,
episodes come out, and then you could sit down and
yeah,
you're like, I'm ready to be immersed. And then you could
yeah.
watch all the episodes. So,
Well, I guess and speaking of like sitting down and being ready to be immersed, I saw that if you pre-planned your binge watches, it was better for your like it was better well-being, and you were saw binge watching as more of a positive thing.
yeah. Yeah, that's the other thing that I found really, well, not frustrating, but like just a difficult thing you had to keep in mind when looking at the research for this was people have different reasons for binge watching. Sometimes they sit down and they do it on purpose, right? They go, I just want to watch these 3 episodes, then I'm caught up, and I'm gonna allocate this time. I've done all of my daily tasks. There's no guilt involved,
Yeah,
and they sit down and do it. Whereas other people will watch an episode and then another one will play, and they're like, oh well, I don't really have to do that other thing. I'll just sit here and watch this, right? So the
yeah,
data doesn't really tell you which of those two they're doing, right? So it's tough. It's tough.
yeah. Because a lot the studies I saw in terms of how they were getting their data was a lot to do with surveys and interviews from
Same,
the
yeah.
ones. So like they asked sort of questions and related to that, like how were you watching them or why and stuff, so they could stem and like they could figure out if people were just binge watching and then say like, oh, missing out on work because of binge watching, they were getting poor sleep and
Oh, okay.
poor work, or were they like say, I'm going to take a day off of work and have this entire day open for this new show that's dropping.
Mm,
Whereas those people were much happier than the people that were missing work because they just watched that whole show.
right.
Where like they planned it out and it was saw as like better experience that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the studies I were looking at didn't actually kind of go into that detail. They were more talking about like connecting depression and loneliness and self-regulation to binge watching, but the way that the people were binge watching wasn't as clearly defined. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's interesting, and I'm glad you were able to grab that because I missed it. But moving on, another big factor that led to people binge watching was simply habit. It was simply just like, this is what I do every day. What's the problem? Like,
Yeah.
right? So if you are likely to come home and turn on your TV and watch that show that you like to watch and let the Netflix do its autoplay thing, then you're more likely to binge watch. It's just simple. It's you know,
Yeah, habits are habits, and we're sort of driven by them. And
mm,
I guess if you create that habit of watching a ton of television,
hmm
it's much harder to break out of that and to do something else. And I guess if you have that habit of watching a ton of TV after work, maybe you're more lonely because you have less time to go socialize because you have the habit of watching so much TV.
yeah, it's very possible. So that was just a simple one that um, I think people kind of overlook.
Yeah,
There's
it's
nothing
dangerous.
dysfunctional about this individual. They just have a habit of watching more TV, right?
But yeah, but the same, someone just has a habit of drinking a lot of alcohol, like just because it's like a habit.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Fair counterpoint.
Like I don't know, I think that it's a dangerous game building some habits that we build sort of without intention.
That's true. Yeah, if you're unintentionally doing the same thing every day and then it becomes a habit, then yeah,
Hmm.
for sure. Okay, the other thing that I found in my research, and I'm not sure if you found it at all, was outside of watching television, it was how stable relationships individuals had. So, for example, if you have a stable relationship with a spouse and with your family, and you have these kind of grounding things, how how does that change how you're watching television? So, what they found in the research was if you have more stable relationships, you are less likely to binge watch. If you have less stable relationships, you are more likely to binge watch. So,
Hmm.
yeah, this one was
What
interesting.
did it say? Sort of more into that, or just sort of that's what they found?
So, I think one of the big reasons was more or less people who have less stable relationships, when they become attached to characters or a certain show, they're less likely to give it up. They don't want to stop watching. They don't want to stop having this attachment because they don't have other stable attachments to rely upon, to lean on.
Hmm. It seems like it goes down that escapism pathway.
Hmm
Is like if they don't have these kind of reliable relationships and like building blocks that they just want to escape their sort of reality, and and if they can get consumed by certain characters that are like super interesting, then they don't really want to leave that world
hmm
and go back to their reality, which is sort of rough.
Yeah, it might be rocky, and that
Yeah.
kind of goes back to these parasocial relationships I was talking about, where you kind of see a friend and a character on a TV show, and the attachment you have, you don't want to turn off the show if you are less likely to have a real friend relationship or
Yeah, like
spousal
you're like kind of
relationship. Hmm
desiring that more than the person that already has it,
Yeah.
because they can sort of fall back to it, right? They're like, oh, I just have
hmm
regular friends, where someone that doesn't have friends, they see friends in the show,
Yeah.
and they'll like probably even like reruns and stuff to sort of get that feeling again, possibly.
Here's the personal real life example I'm going to give you.
Okay.
Remember that time you went through a shitty breakup? Remember that time? Were you more likely to watch a whole bunch of that one show you really like in a row, or were you less likely? You're probably more likely. You're probably more likely to sit and watch that show because you were in a shitty mood and you felt crappy and everything in your life just changed. That's what we're getting at with this one.
Something familiar and
Yeah,
positive,
exactly.
and that probably influences what type of television too is, what kind of.
Yeah, a lot of the studies that I was I was looking through the type of television was documented, and it was a majority drama, a majority, and also a majority of the people who were doing the binge watching were female. I don't know if that's because there
Oh,
was some
really?
sort of skew in who wanted to participate in the study, but um, almost every study I found there was like 60% or higher female to male ratio.
Hmm. I
So
would thought it would have been closer, but hmm. I wonder if just like there's other mediums that are kind of playing a part, right?
yeah, I could see that more being the males are more likely to binge on a video game, and the females are more likely to binge TV. These are
Yeah.
stereotypes, of course, and I'm not trying to paint anyone in any picture here, but those are just what I saw.
Hmm.
Mhm. So, I think the next thing we want to talk about is what are the detrimental effects of binge watching? We kind of poked at it earlier, talking about how people are losing sleep or how you're kind of disregarding your physical health by just sitting and watching a TV show. So, Johnny, I think you did a lot more research on this than I did. What did you find for that kind of thing?
Well, I guess outside of sort of the guilt and loneliness and sort of depression that we've talked about, um, like obesity was a big one. The two big physical ones were like obesity and fatigue slash lack of sleep. And the lack of sleep one could be is a lot easier to sort of explain because like say you're binge watching a show right before bed, your brain is still going, it's still moving, like the cognitive pre-sleep arousal, I think it's described as.
Yeah,
um
that makes sense.
like and it's not just television or binge watching TV. Like if you're watching, like if you're doing a lot of something like that, like not just TV, but like say you're playing a ton of video games or you're on your phone a ton,
Hmm.
it was all that sort of stuff contributing to like the onset delay of sleep. So like it was taking people a lot longer to fall asleep, and then they would get less sleep, and then they would wake up fatigued. And it was way higher than people that just only watched the linear scheduled television. That was just the one episode a week or whatever. Like so, they were comparing and contrasting to that,
Hmm.
and it was when you watched a whole bunch of episodes before bed was making a large impact.
Yeah,
And I guess the obesity one sort of, I guess, explains itself. Like unless you're on your exercise bike binge watching television,
which people do,
which
which
I
with modern technology is becoming more and more
yeah
reachable, But no, yeah, I agree. It's more likely that somebody is sitting and watching and
yeah.
consuming a TV show as they had for the last 20 years, right?
and when you're eating while watching TV, you tend to consume a lot more because you're not eating with intention. You're not really knowing how what's your limit of eating, right? You'll just keep eating and eating.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big things in the States is a lot of people eat, say, their dinners in front of the TV, and overeating is so much larger percentage compared to people that say like eat at a dinner table with family.
Huh, I didn't know that. It's interesting. Well, another reason not to binge
But
watch.
that's just not always binge watching. That could also just be television.
Right.
But
Yeah. But, I understand what you're saying.
mhm,
In that the binge watching, if you're binge watching, you're more likely to be watching more TV than not, right? And the more TV you're watching, the more sitting around you're doing. The more sitting around you're
mhm,
doing, the more potential eating you're doing. It's not good for you.
yeah. And then I guess one of the social uh, disadvantages, I guess you'd call it, um, was like the maintenance of relationships. I guess if you're watching a lot of television, binging a lot of television, you're less likely to keep up with specific social relationships,
Hmm.
and you might like not message someone too often, and the relationship goes or this or that,
Yeah.
which could lead to loneliness.
Oh, oh,
There it is. There's a common theme. Um, and then the two that we discussed for like sort of mental was loneliness and depression, which was a lot harder to kind of
pin.
tie into.
It's harder to pin down for sure.
Was there anything that you saw that I didn't mention?
With regards to like these physical things, no, I think you kind of covered it pretty well. I think that was really interesting what you said about firstly about the lack of sleep because I've had those nights too where I've gone to bed and I've just been like, wait, did he actually say that to that other guy in that show? Like, wow, I gotta
Yeah,
first I have to try to memorize it all. Like I gotta know exactly what happened in the show, and then I have to critically think about all the crazy things that were said and done, and did I like it? Did I just, and then you
yeah,
just like you're not asleep until
yeah.
3 hours after you lay down. So that one for sure, I've personally felt, and I feel like a lot of people have as well, personally felt that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And to just know, hey, don't watch 3 episodes of that show before bed. Like it's a pretty simple thing, and you'll be able to sleep better, right? This
Yeah.
is, yeah, I think that's a big
It's
one.
it's just sort of watching with intent.
Yeah, like when you sit down and watch a show, make time for it, and then sleep. The whole sleep schedule thing is a whole different topic, but
But that's where
planning how you sleep is important.
the Netflix post play features. That's where they get everybody though. The autoplay.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, okay, it's bedtime. 3 seconds later, the next episode's already starting. You're like, I guess I'll watch it. Like it's
Yeah.
already on. Yeah,
It's a Friday night. I don't have to wake up tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. So, with that in mind, see, this is a good lead in, I think, into what I want to talk about next was how are the TV shows themselves changing to fit the binge watching idea? Because what we are seeing now with our change to TV4 is binge watching is becoming the new norm. People want shows that are deeper than they previously were. If you if you were watching a show that was like much deeper in the past, there was usually like that lead in, like here's what happened last week, and they kind of give you an over, and then you're like, ah, yes, okay, I remember. But nowadays, you can go even deeper. You can have so many intricate relationships with characters and with different themes within a show that people can follow now. You can follow the depth and you can remember the specific things that people said and did in the previous episode because of this binge style of watching. So, how are the writers changing what we're watching? What do you think, Johnny?
I think just like one of the I think that the writers are probably enjoying the type of era that we're in
Mm-hmm.
because you can have so many more niche kind of television shows. Like I feel like you can be so much more creative. Um, Back in the old days with television, you had to be very broad, very few channels, a lot of people watching that specific
Yeah.
like those shows where you had to kind of cater to like all the people.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now you've there's big enough niches of groups of people and you can sort of target these audiences and stuff, which I think is kind of interesting. And in terms of how the shows are kind of writing towards binge watching, they're I don't know, kind of manipulating our emotions a lot, like our with characters that maybe we can relate to or characters that make us feel certain things,
Mm-hmm.
or like at the end of an episode there's a huge cliffhanger in
Yeah.
order for us to have anxiety, for us to continue watching. um
No. Yeah.
Again,
Yeah. For
like that's
sure.
probably not a new idea of is like a cliffhanger, but it's definitely you see it almost in every series now.
Yeah. If the next episode is available for you to watch, and you get to the end of your current episode, and it's on a cliffhanger, and you're like, well, I could just know what happens 2 seconds from now. Why wouldn't I just watch the next episode, right? This is
Hmm.
something that I think a lot of writers are really seizing. It's like we need you to enjoy our show, so we need you to watch the whole show, right? We need to be able to get another season. to keep our job.
Yeah,
So if we have so many people finishing this season within the first week, like it's
yeah.
gonna look great for us. So we're gonna keep you on the emotional hook the whole way through, right? And
Do you think that? Oh, sorry to cut you off, but do you think they're like they're specifically writing it to make the show more addicting, or is it sort of just a product?
I don't.
Like I think there's a lot more higher quality television coming out now than probably ever.
Hmm.
There's just sheer content of everything. It just makes me wonder if they're all like if it's just a product or if they're actually like how do we get this to be the most addicting shows ever?
Hmm. I think one leads into the other. I think the idea of having like a really really good show leads into the idea of keeping people on the hook. Because people love this emotion. Like when you're invested deeply into the emotions of a show and you feel the need to go to the next episode, that's like to people that's like really good TV, right? I think
Mhm.
I think a large amount of people would say if they're drawn from the first episode to the second episode because of an emotional attachment or cliffhanger, they're like thinking this is good television. So I think it is becoming more addictive, but I also think it's more addictive based on the person because like you said there's so many niche audiences that you can pick and choose the show that you're going to be addicted to.
Yeah, they're catered more to you.
Yeah.
There's more personalization, so then you're gonna get hooked more.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the point. But it's interesting kind of what we're going through with uh then this new wave of writing. And the other thing that I saw that was interesting watching a recent episode of The Mandalorian, and I've referenced it a bunch, but these shows no longer have to fit into a certain time crunch. So I was watching an episode and it was 45 minutes long, and then the next episode was 35 minutes long. So there was flexibility for the writers
Huh.
to make their shows as long as they needed to be. They said, you know what, trim the fat on this episode. This is what we want the people to see. 35 minutes. Or you know what, this one needs more time. This one needs to be an hour and 20 minutes. Like this is going to be a good one, right? It's going to be
Huh.
nice and long. So like I think that's an interesting thing that a lot of people need to take into consideration because it hasn't really been done as much. Is making the times catered to the episode, and they don't have to be the same time every time. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Which probably improves the quality
Yeah, yeah,
significantly.
yeah. I would hope so. There's no
That's an
filler.
interesting point. Not something I've thought about before. Is looking at the duration of it and seeing the contrast.
Hmm.
Because usually it's like a 30-minute show or an hour show with the occasional maybe 45-minute show because that's without ads or whatever, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I think just the idea that the writers and producers of all these shows have more flexibility with what they're doing. There's more there's more catering and more customization to a TV show that
Yeah,
now than there has ever been before. And that's something that keeps people attached, right?
yeah.
You can skim the fat, you can add more, like whatever you want to do, you can do nowadays.
Hmm.
All right.
And I guess it sort of segues into the kind of advertising from here is
Mm-hmm.
if the writers are getting more creative, I think the advertisers have to get more creative too because advertisers like people that binge watch do not respond well to advertisements whatsoever.
Yeah.
It sort of breaks their immersion from the series. So it's at first it sort of affected the funding going into these new shows because the advertisers, the sponsors and stuff weren't really making their money back on the first shows, but now they're having to get creative with their advertising within the show,
Mm-hmm.
like product placements, for example. Like say you're watching one of your favorite shows and one of your favorite characters just always drinking a Coke, or like they're at a restaurant and the restaurant seems to be like McDonald's or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and you sort of associate your favorite character with a Coke. You're like, oh man, I want a Coke now,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just being the commercial, just Coke, 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 and then your show's back on. Now it's in the show, kind of this subconscious prompt for you to drink Coke. You're, oh, I'm thirsty, and it's just kind of like associated, oh, Coke would be cool or whatever, for example.
Yes, the advertisers are currently attempting to incept all of us, and it's frustrating because I have bought so much Coke recently. No, it's yeah, that's interesting because I haven't been looking for this, right? Like this is something that I personally haven't noticed, right? Like
Hmm.
we can say this is something that the advertisers could be attempting to do, and it could be true. I just haven't seen it. And when you're just,
Subconscious.
I know,
They've got you hooked in.
I know.
You're not aware.
I'm trying to think of like what have I bought recently that could have been incepted into my brain. Um, but yeah, it's tough because this is like one of the most subtle things that advertisers going to be doing, and we've always had in-your-face advertising for so long.
Hmm.
And when you kind of, this is an anecdote, but my people that I know who are older are like attached to some of the advertisements they see on TV. Like if you like there's a whole culture of people talking about the ads that come up on TV all the time. Oh, that was a good one. That was a bad one.
Yeah.
Like
Even the commercials become water cooler talk.
yeah, exactly. People like to talk about the commercials. Nowadays, nobody likes to talk about the
Like
commercials.
the Super
They hate it.
Bowl, but like the
Yeah.
Super Bowl, that was like one of the highlights. Was everyone like people that didn't want to watch for the football, they watched because of the commercials.
Yeah. And you know what? I don't care. They can go away too. You know
Yeah,
what? Like we I think our generation and younger just don't want to deal with this at all. So the advertisers are
yeah,
really going to have to change, and maybe they have already. The other thing I
yeah,
wanted to note though was that these streaming platforms are doing a lot of advertising for their platform. So what you'll see is Netflix will try to really, really push a new show that's coming out. Let's say back when they had Arrested Development, they were probably putting it up on all the different TV networks. Come watch Arrested Development on Netflix. Come, we have a whole new season. You know, this is brand spanking new. Come watch us. Come watch us. Come watch us. And then, depending on how many subscribers they get based on new shows coming out, they can kind of gauge people's interest. So I think,
yeah. Like especially pushing their own created content, like the Netflix exclusives and stuff.
exactly. So I think the advertisers for other products besides, of course, they need besides, of course, the streaming platforms, they need to change what they're doing and how they're doing it to make us want to buy their products. Because
Yeah.
if I'm watching my fantasy shows, there's no Coke, right? So, well, unless there's a random Starbucks cup in a Game of Thrones episode, but that was a bit of a mistake, I think. Yeah. So I think that brings us to the end of our discussion on binge watching. Do you have anything else to add?
I think we've covered everything I could possibly think of in terms of binge watching. Um, I don't know, just kind of the classic I'd like to always say is just kind of be attentive of what you're watching, and yeah.
And if you want to binge watch a show, set aside time, make sure you've done everything you've done, and don't idly let it go to the next episode. I think that's our advice. And also, you can turn autoplay off. This is something that you can do.
Yeah.
Um, And I think that sums it up for me too. I just wanted to remind everyone again, if you like this episode, if you didn't like this episode, if you thought we got a bunch of crap wrong on this episode or on previous episodes, drop us a line. We're at iqmindspodcast@gmail.com. That's iqmindspodcast @gmail.com. Until the next time, when we give you something to think about, have a great night and see you next time.